Hey everyone out there on YouTube land, Dan here from GeekCast Radio doing another graphic thoughts video. This is where I go through some of the recent graphic novels I've been reading, giving you my thoughts and opinions on them, and kind of let you know what's out there. Again, with these graphic thoughts videos, I try to do a variety of different books that hit on different topics, and usually not just trade paperbacks of books I've been reading, but rather stuff that I've never really talked about before, either on a comic haul video or an actual review. And one thing that, if you've been watching these, I've been trying to do is actually read more manga. I've not read a lot of manga. This is probably like my 5th or 6th manga novel that I've read. And this is High Rise Invasion. And I have nothing against it, just something that like I didn't really read growing up as a kid. I kind of came before the generation where manga kind of exploded. I've watched some anime here and there, but typically it doesn't super appeal to me. And some of the stuff I've read I've liked, but nothing's ever really like blown me away. And I've been hesitant to kind of jump on some of those series that are like been going on forever. So I've been trying to start with new ones. And this High Rise is, I thought it looked kind of interesting. I wasn't really sure what it was about. And legitimately it starts off and you have this woman, and well, I say woman, but she's like a high schooler, kind of wake up and she's in this building and she doesn't know why. She's just like, why am I in this building? What's going on? And legitimately like going from rooftop to rooftop as these people in these crazy masks, if I can show you, are trying to hunt her down. And it's really just her trying to figure out surviving and going to, she can't go downstairs to any of the buildings. Everything is blocked off. She sees these rope bridges. She doesn't even know how she's gotten there. It's like there's no one else really there. She runs into some people, but there's like, you know, it seems like it's an apocalyptic event happened. And one thing I noticed from some of the manga that I have read, one of the consistent aspects of it, again, this is, you know, a very small sample size, is like someone watching a half of football and saying, you know, the thing about football is, and let me give you my opinion on it, is that a lot of the manga I've read is very self-aware. In the sense of, I see a lot of manga that often talks about manga within itself. And this, too, is you have this girl who's not a manga fan, but her brother is, and she talks about, like, she seems to be very willing to accept some of the absurdity of the fact that I'm in another dimension, this must be what it is, okay, let me figure it out, and find a solution to this problem. Which I guess I kind of get. I guess maybe that would be with this generation, like, you know, when you get so inundated with insanity and crazy thoughts, and like you see these stories over and over again, you would just, if it ever happened to you, you would, I guess, be able to adapt quicker. I don't know. I just found that interesting. They were so really much more willing to accept just the most insane option ever. It's like, okay, it's, you know, often, at least for like you know, Western stories and things of this nature, usually the trope would be, oh, this is just a dream, let me wake up. But from some of the stories I read, it's like, okay, well, I know in manga this means this, and these are the stories I've read, so because of that, let me use the rules of the different stories I've read and video games I've played to figure out my way to this solution. And it does, I think, make for a more interesting story, because it's like, you know, they don't fall for the same traps that you would often see. They can be a little bit smarter, and I could see why this would appeal to like the target audience, because it would be often what people you know, of that age would want to do in those situations. And that's really, like, that's pretty much the premise of this book. She's going from place to place, bit by bit things show up. She sees a helicopter, she runs into some other people, she runs into more people with those, you know, happy faced masks, and it kind of grows from there. The big thing is that her brother's there too, so she hears her brother on the phone, and she's just trying to find him and kind of find a way out of this. And I gotta say, like, for the concept is kind of crazy, but it ends up working. It limits itself because you're legitimately dealing with just moving from rooftop to rooftop, and I was worried it'd be kind of repetitive, because it'd be like, it would be something like a video game where it's like, okay, excuse me, on this level we have to do this, on this level we have to find this solution. But it did progress actually quite nicely, and there were a lot of different twists and turns in it. And this is volumes 1 and 2. So, of all the manga I've read, I thought this was, you know, it was well paced. It was kind of a fun story. There were some of those tropes that you often see with manga, like, you know, the teenage girl that's way too old and sexualized for my taste, which it's hard to kind of go with. But at least I felt like as a character, she was actually quite strong, as I mentioned, and she actually kind of, I like that she was self-aware and solved her own problems, you know, instead of just like screaming and running away. So if you're looking to get in manga and like myself, I would recommend picking up High Rise Invasion. One of the better mangas I've read. A very different book in every way, shape, and form is Apollo. Man, sorry for the glare. And this is by Finch, Baker, and Collins. Not David Finch, but a different Finch. And what this is about is that. It's about Apollo, the first... Well, really, it covers a lot of the Apollo missions, but the big focus of this is on the actual landing on the moon itself with Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. And I was interested in picking this up and seeing, how it was able to tell this story. And I feel like, too, it's like... I know we have there's a movie coming up with... there's a Neil Armstrong biography coming up from the director of La La Land. I think Ryan Gosling's playing Neil Armstrong. And I've heard people say, like, well, how can you get drama out of that? Like, he's just going to the moon. We know the ending to that story. And it's like, I kind of realize we take the moon landing for granted in a way, where it's like this one of the greatest achievements of mankind, and I don't think we kind of appreciate this, like the stakes that were there and the risks that these people are taking in order to actually go on this adventure. Like that, we know that they came back, but the uncertainty that they had at the time, considering some of they touch upon some of the past disasters with Apollo, the Apollo missions, the famous mission where you had those astronauts that burned alive, and how that nearly derailed the entire program. And it gets into some of the one of the excerpts on the back is it kind of tries to cover the full story. Even some of the wives' tales and the urban legends. And yeah, I know we have those people who think the moon landing didn't happen and everything like that. It doesn't really touch upon that, but there are some more surreal moments, if I can pull one up, which I don't think came off as a little more silly than intended. Like there's this sequence with... it was a daydream sequence with this hippie showing up, kind of impacting Buzz Aldrin, which was kind of weird, and it came off of a little bit more hokey than intended. But there are some interesting aspects of it talking about the decision of who gets to why was Neil Armstrong the person to get off the Eagle first? Why was he the first person to step on the moon over Buzz Aldrin? And there's different conversations of why that was. Partially, was it because he was a civilian, so it looked better for NASA? Was it simply because of how the seating was, and it was easier for him to get out based upon where he was located? And there, there's a conversation with Buzz Aldrin kind of going over that, and because obviously knowing what that would mean. But I think it's just kind of interesting. It was just a fascinating reading because it talks about one of those moments where I feel like, obviously today it's changed, but where there you actually saw kind of mankind from around the world actually just kind of unite in awe at achievement and what can be accomplished. And it's just there's not many moments where there's a lack of cynicism with something that can occur, especially today. So it felt kind of welcoming in that sense. And I do find the Apollo stuff quite fascinating. I love a lot of the movies about it, from Apollo 13, obviously a very different story, to I can't think of the movie with John Glenn and Ed Harris as John Glenn in the 80s. It's slipping my mind. It always happens when you put it's like the video camera makes your mind go blank when you think about these things. But if you're interested about the Apollo missions, and you like that history, or if you're excited for the upcoming Armstrong biography and you want to get something out of it, definitely check this out. It's actually a good all ages book. I think anyone 8 to 18, or anyone it's really easy read for the most part. So this would probably be a good summer read for a kid, even though I know summer's almost over. But it ended up being quite good. I would advise picking up. The art itself is, again, it's your straightforward biography with a little bit of, or not biography, but it's your straightforward story, a retelling of history with a little bit of different things thrown in. That little bit, the surrealness, like I mentioned, wasn't as effective, but the actual story itself I thought was well told. And you got, I think, a good sense of who those people were, who those astronauts were, who Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were, outside of the fact that, they who they are in a historical context. The next book that I read was The Strange. And this is a very different book as well. I feel like I say that a lot, but even in art and story, it's a very simple story, but a very important one in the sense of The Strange is about this guy who who moves into New York City, and he's coming from another country trying to make his living, and his story is actually told through the perspective of a lot of different people in animals, actually, even from a crow to the police officers to his neighbors, and it's all about perspective. It's all about seeing his life through the perspective of others, and he comes there legally and illegally, and it's kind of him trying to get out. He's in a horrible situation at his home country. Things are awful. He's trying to help his family out, so he ends up moving into the actual United States, and it's broken up into these different chapters. Like we have the Crow, and the Crow talks about him observing the stranger and what his observations are, what he sees. It reminded me a lot of in the depiction and like how it used like animals rather than people. Something like Mouse. It's not as good as Mouse because Mouse is like one of the best comics ever, but using that type of imagery to tell a story about the disenfranchised, those that were certainly tossed aside by society, and it's certainly effective. And I don't know if that was intentional, but it really had me thinking of that. Again, a very kind of sketchy art style, and I think it was an approach that was effective because, in a way, like you don't get that person's perspective of what their actual life story is because you're just hearing it from other people, and which could be frustrating, but I think it's frustrating in a good way, in the sense of like getting a sense of what it feels like not to be heard, and just kind of being kind of lost in the shuffle, and why someone would, especially a topic like this that is so so much in the news now and really forever, but especially now there's a lot of heated debate about this and what people what it shouldn't be done. So I thought it was a quite a good take on it, a good perspective to see what exactly is happening, and how people who come to the country, sometimes they're misused. They're they're working in kind of really bad locations for little limited pay, but people certainly will take advantage of that until it's no longer beneficial to them. So definitely would advise, again, another book I would advise picking up. Does a good job of kind of providing that story. It's not necessarily, I don't know if I read this and said, well, that's a new take, or that's something I didn't think about before, or this brings an entirely new idea to this topic, but I thought it was at least effectively done, and I did like the concept of how it used just different people to tell its story. I thought that was it made it a little bit less straightforward. One of the books that's getting kind of a lot of notoriety this year is Yellow Negros. When I looked at some of halfway through the year, I looked at what's on the best of the year so far list, and this was on a lot of lists, and it finally came to my local library, so I picked it up and was kind of excited to read it and see what is this all about. I didn't know anything about it outside the fact that it's getting rave reviews. It's a French comic that's been translated, and the art style, I don't know what they use in the sense of materials, but it does have almost like a charcoal look to it. This is the beginning, but it changes its style as it moves on. It gets more kind of traditional look to it, and it's about these people growing up living in France. They're from Africa. It's a brother and sister. They're there again, illegally or kind of legally. It depends, I guess, but they're just trying to live their life, and they end up getting befriended by this gentleman here who himself is going through a lot. Like he's a very odd person, and he talks. He's in a way trying to help them, but also has a lot of personal problems. You really can't tell. He seems they're very skeptical of him, not just because he thinks he's doing something or trying to get them in trouble, but he just seems like he's maybe mentally dangerous in a way, like in the sense of there's something about him they just don't trust, or he says a lot of strange things, like he calls them like his son, and it's just like there's something. It feels like he's a man who's lost, and he's around these people who are there, and he's kind of using them to kind of find his way as well, but in the meantime doing some strange things, and I thought this was beautifully written because you get all these different perspectives. You have the the one guy who's going out with a French girl, and she's in the car with her grandfather, and it's like, why haven't you talked about your boyfriend? And it's like, well, he's not black, is he? And she kind of says yes, and it becomes this big issue of conflict between her and her family. But it has a lot of different pieces of that, definitely giving you a life, especially this being not an American story, but a story in a different country. It was interesting hearing this perspective and seeing kind of how it definitely matches with a lot of the tribulations of people in the United States, but also kind of a little bit different. I will say though, like I thought it was elegantly written. It's very poetic, but at the same time, I felt the narrative itself was a little hard to follow, and I don't know if that was just me or what, but like by the end of it, I felt like I wasn't fully sure exactly what this was going for, or I felt very disconnected from it. Not in the sense of like where it was trying to go. I just felt it went back and forth between all these kind of a couple of these different storylines, and it felt like by the end of it, not much had happened or progressed or was said. There was some of the moments where you kind of see kind of what these people are dealing with, and hearing kind of their fears and what society has driven them to do in order to kind of to feel safe, was fascinating. But the entire, like the sums worked, the whole just didn't work for me, basically. So I can definitely see why people love it, and I think maybe a reread for myself could certainly be helpful. But I just, like, with the expectations and stuff like that, I was hoping to be like emotionally impacted or kind of be outside of just being impressed by the verbiage and the language of it. Just the story itself didn't necessarily work for me as much as I was hoping for. But very different. This is I talked about trade. This actually is a trade paperback. This is the Escapist from Dark Horse, and the Escapist is a character I personally never heard of, but he's actually a Silver Age character that Dark Horse, I guess now at least owns the rights to. And what this is, it's a bunch of different stories that writers have done for the character, and it's a huge list of writers and artists. Like even there's a Harold Chaykin story in this. And I found this was great. Like I felt I didn't know if this came out because Mr. Miracle is really popular right now, so I was like, oh, did they just try to ape that? But this is a lot of these stories actually like come from early 2000s to now, and it's a big book. There's a ton of stuff in here, and I got this from the library, but I so want to kind of actually buy this because not only does it have the actual stories, but it has a lot of these excerpts and this history about the character, and I'm becoming more and more fascinated with the history of comics. And I've watched a lot of documentaries, and they always hit on like the high points, the points you often hear about. But some of the smaller stories, just the individual stories, especially like characters like this, I find those fascinating. So there was tons of information in this outside of just the stories themselves. So if you're a fan of history, a fan of that age, it works not only as a good comic, but also just kind of a history lesson into how comics have changed, especially like how these characters, like just how characters traverse from different publications. Not all the stories I say were great by any means. When you have so many stories by different artists and creators, some work better than others. I actually thought the Howard Chaykin story was one of my favorites. The art styles do very, very differently, which makes sense because you're talking about stories. This wasn't, these weren't originally designed for one giant trade paperback. I think a lot of them appeared in different, Dark Horse Presents and things like that, or single issues here and there. But I just, the Escapist is his deal is very much that he escapes. And the opening story is actually kind of like a throwback World War II story where he goes to, it seems like a stand-in for China, as like a propaganda move to try to get people to, kind of overthrow or rise up against their, evil empire leader. But it doesn't necessarily go the way he expected, and he tries to not only use his ability, but try to empower people in that community as well. And then the Howard Chaykin story is, Howard Chaykin's one of those creators that his art, at least, was something I was never the hugest fan of to begin with. I've kind of grown to like it. I think actually, oddly, my first experience with Howard Chaykin was when he drew for Blade in the early 2000s, and it seemed kind of odd to me, and I didn't really love I always feel like his faces looked too similar all the time. But knowing that he's, and then it wasn't until later I learned about just how much of an impact he's had on comics. Even recently, I know he's been a controversial figure, but I thought his story in this was quite good. So if you are a fan of that, like say you maybe want a more classic take on superheroes, I think it kind of made me think of the American Flag, or I forget this series right now for Titan that was a Jack Kirby creation that they are now moving, that they're continuing. This doesn't necessarily, again, with all the different stories, some take place back in the day and age where the character came out, some are more updated, but like I said, it's just packed. It's worth every, it's a well told. There's even different adaptations of the character. There's a lot in this. This is a really well put together book, trade paperback, because Dark Horse I think really went all out on this, and I'm surprised it's not getting more attention or anything like that. For collected editions, I could definitely see this being up as nominated for some sort of Eisner, because there's a lot of love and admiration put in this. And only thing I would wish, I don't know if there was a hardcover, but I think this was a hardcover, would be even better, because there is so much in here. And but yeah. And I usually try to save my favorite book for last, and I didn't expect much from this book. And again, expectations have a lot to do with how you end up enjoying something. But this book I ended up really loving. It's Generations by Flavia Biondi. Again, this is an Italian story that's been translated, and I've been really loving really European comics as of late. But this is honestly, like, reading this, I never would have. It doesn't feel like an Italian or European comic. I mean, outside of just some of the references to Milan and things like that. But the story itself it's a very simple story. And when I talk about the story, it seems like, well, that seems very stereotypical or very trite or very basic. And it's just about this gentleman here who is coming back home. He was living in Milan with his boyfriend, and he moves back home because they have kind of a falling out, and he's going back to his family, but he can't go back to live with his dad because his dad is not approving of his lifestyle. So he goes back to live with other relatives, which is like his aunt and grandmother, and they don't know that he's actually gay. His father told him that he moved to Milan for his studies. So when he shows up, they're like, "Oh, I thought you were going to school," and he's like, "Oh, that's what he told you." So he doesn't want them to kind of know that, his father to know that he's back. So he begins living with them and kind of just trying to find his way, and he ends up being kind of a mooch. He's just kind of laying around the house, not doing anything, and some of the relatives have no issue with it. He has one aunt who just feels like he is overstaying his welcome and needs to do something. So it's him just trying to just find himself and figure things out. And what I found really interesting about this, and like I mentioned, it could sound stereotypical, but I think what makes it work is what it doesn't do, and what it does do in between. Like, it's the setup is very similar, but sometimes when you get things like that, it's where it goes and where it changes direction when you expect it to go. For example, like, there is kind of set up this like piece where you think, oh, this could be a potential relationship that's going to solve this problem, and this is going to bring him out of this, and this is where it's going, but it ends up going in an unexpected direction. I also found the family itself, like, there was an intimacy to it that I wasn't expecting. It felt very real, to the point where, when I got to the back of this book, I'm like, okay, this must be based on the true story of the author. They must be saying, like, hey, this, giving an adaptation of what occurred in their life, but finding out that's not really the case. And I was really surprised by that. And to me, that was a good sign of just how effective this story was. And by the end of it, like, it dawned on me how much I liked it when there was a major event that happens near the end, and it had an emotional impact on me that I was not really expecting. It was like, wow, that kind of came out of nowhere. I was liking it, but it was just like, it kind of snuck on me, and like, wow, that moment, or that, I ended up really caring about these characters in more ways than I even realized as I was reading it. So by the end of it, I'm like, wow, that was quite a good read, and I enjoyed it a lot. It was very moving, and as the title indicates, it does talk about family and generations, but it doesn't hammer home that point. It's not like it says, oh, and this generation thinks this, and this is the way they act, or this generation is this way. It's just kind of how people kind of interact and live with one another and their viewpoints on things. And I would say, if anything, my my one gripe is there isn't, like I mentioned, there's an aunt in this who is like the stereotypical bad person in a way, the antagonist, who is more of a villain. But you understand her perspective, but she just seemed maybe a little too stereotypical or too easy of a target to put everything on. But outside of that, it felt very natural, and in the sense of when he sits down and have a conversation with his one cousin talking about like what he's doing, and he mentions that I'm going out with this one girl. She's like, girl, I thought but he never told her, but she was able to just kind of figure things out, and it was just like an open and honest. It didn't hammer home the point. There's just a lot of subtlety in this, and I would highly recommend picking this up. I think it's going to end up certainly being in my list of the favorite books of the year. Don't know where yet, still a lot to come out, but I might be hyping it up too much. Like I said, it's not necessarily trying to do, it's not scope-wise or going for these amazing things, but I thought just the simplicity of it was effective in that sense. But all right, well, I've rambled enough for this video. One of the bigger, actually probably the biggest graphic novels, graphic haul videos I've talked about. Usually I do 4 books. I actually did more, mostly because I have to return a lot of these books to the library. So and get those 25-cent fines. They start adding up. But that's it for me. If you want to listen to more of my stuff, check out GeekCast Radio. Check out this YouTube page. Thanks for listening. I appreciate any comments, any people who take the time to watch my stuff. It's honestly really appreciated. It's hugely helpful. So thanks for all that. And just remember, comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, thanks for watching.